back to the Curious Clinicians, a medical podcast that asks why. I'm Hannah Abrams, and I'm joined, as always, by Tony Brew and Avi Cooper. Hey, guys.
Hey, Hannah.
Hey,
Avi.
Good evening. Hello.
All right, so today is a milestone because in our 4+ years of podcasting, getting close to 100 episodes, we have rarely, if ever, returned to topics that we covered previously. But on this episode, we are going to do just that. We are going to go back to episode 72, which was Bringing Up Beethoven. It aired a little bit less than a year ago on June 13th, 2023. And on it, we investigated theories surrounding one of the great mysteries in the history of music, why Beethoven went deaf. Today, we are going to talk about some newly released data, which seems like the mystery may have been solved. So, Avi, fill us in. What has happened since Bringing Up Beethoven?
Yeah, it's so we've had like late breaking developments in this like 200+ year old mystery that maybe it's been solved, but we'll see if that's true, or how convincing it is that it's been solved. We certainly have some of the first objective evidence of a potential cause, right? That's really exciting. This very rarely happens, I think, with these questions. But just to recap, in episode 72, we talked about how beginning in his late 20s, Beethoven developed a severe tinnitus. And he began, unfortunately, to progressively lose his hearing, eventually went totally deaf. We talked about how this really ended his career as a concert pianist and a conductor because he couldn't hear the music he was performing. But he found a way through, grit and talent to compose some of the most important music in the Western classical canon. Again, in total deafness, including, his Ode to Joy, Ninth Symphony masterpiece, which was really, really remarkable. And that was the story we told in episode 72.
In that episode, we talked about how Beethoven had other chronic symptoms beyond the deafness, even before he ultimately died of liver failure. And this included things like a persistently painful, inflamed eye that lasted about a year. He had GI symptoms like abdominal pain and chronic diarrhea. He had arthralgias. He had sort of all these things that sort of suggest a systemic syndrome. And Avi, in that episode, you reviewed some of the theories that could have potentially explained this collection of things, including the deafness. Can you kind of remind me and Hannah and the listeners, what was that? What was some of the things that we talked about at that time?
Yeah, so we discussed in that episode, that some have wondered if he might have had syphilis, which could potentially have caused some vascular sclerosis of his inner ears. Others have wondered about Paget's disease, sarcoidosis, lupus. We discussed the possibility of Cogan syndrome, which is a medium vessel vasculitis that can affect, lots of different parts of the body. But classically, as Cogan described it, deafness and inflammatory eye disease, both of which Beethoven had. And as we discussed in that episode, he also was found recently to have genetic risk factors for hemochromatosis. So, I think, we sort of cast a wide net there.
Yeah, it's a pretty broad differential.
Sounds like the medical student's differential on rounds.
This could be
Cogan
literally
syndrome.
anything.
So we had also mentioned briefly lead poisoning in the episode and that was a potential explanation for his deafness that had been disproven. Is that still the case? Leading question.
Right. You can only know what you know when you know it, right? So when we recorded the June 2023 episode, that was the current thinking. And if you'll recall, we talked about the various locks of Beethoven's hair that have been preserved and then have been sort of, I think, intermittently potentially available for forensic analysis. They were named after the people who had possession of them at certain times, often like the first person that Beethoven gave them to. In April 2023, there was a research group in Europe that published a genetic analysis of several locks of Beethoven's hair, and they published it in the journal Cell. The lock of hair that had been found have high lead levels previously, which is known as the Hiller lock, it was shown to be inauthentic. It was actually hair from a woman. And so it was clearly not Beethoven's hair. It did have high lead levels. So the thinking was that there was no reason to suspect lead poisoning anymore once the Hiller lock was determined to be, inauthentic based on this genetic analysis.
But here we are again. And so there's sort of this sense of either a but or a caveat. Is the update that the Hiller lock was actually authentic in the end?
No.
Okay,
that was actually from a woman.
That was one hypothesis.
Yep,
Yeah.
that was from a female, so not from Beethoven's head. But the same group, they tested the lead levels of two of the other locks that were authenticated as having been taken from Beethoven, specifically the Berman lock and the Halm-Thayer lock. They were both collected from him toward the end of his life in the 1820s. And so this group did mass spectrometry to measure lead levels on both of these locks of hair. And they reported the results in a letter to the journal Clinical Chemistry it was just recently published in June 2024. So by the time this episode comes out, maybe 2-3 months before. And they found that Beethoven had extremely high lead levels in his hair at the end of his life. Which is, of course, suggestive that he had similarly high serum lead levels. They generally seem to correlate. So the Berman lock had about 250 micrograms per gram of lead, while the Halm-Thayer lock had about 375 micrograms per gram of lead. And so those are much, much higher than the upper limit of normal, which is less than 4 micrograms per gram. So considerably higher.
That's a lot of lead. That's a lot higher.
It's a lot of lead, lead poisoning as a cause for his deafness. It clearly puts it back in play, I think. And the researchers, they also found some mercury and arsenic in his hair too. So Beethoven seems to have been exposed to a lot of stuff in his lifetime.
Yeah.
So how would Beethoven have been exposed to so much lead?
Right. I mean, it's a lot of lead. So the authors of this newest report, they mentioned that plumbed wine could be to blame. So we know that Beethoven, he drank a lot of wine. Ultimately, he died of what's been attributed to alcohol-related liver disease. And dating back to ancient times, lead has been used as a sweetener and a preservative in wine, specifically lead acetate, which would have been used in Beethoven's lifetime, which creates so-called plumbed wine. The corks for wine were also commonly soaked in lead salt to help get a better seal on the wine bottle. A lot of exposure that way from the alcohol he would have been drinking. The authors also theorized that Beethoven, he could have been exposed to lead from contamination in his diet, as well as medical treatments that were that might have involved lead or had some lead in it too, that he might have received, because again he tried lots of different things to help with his deafness. It's also important to remember, I think, that lead was everywhere, basically until very recently in history. Plumbing, makeup, food storage containers, paint, weapons, gasoline. It was sort of seen as this miracle metal because it's strong, it's durable, it's malleable, and widely available, and it's inexpensive. So all of that made lead, for most of sort of, the recent human history, to be extremely prevalent in use in all phases of life in many parts of the world. But unfortunately, it's extremely toxic, and it also tends to accumulate in bone and then hang out in one's body for decades, including one's hair.
Right. So I feel confident that with these two locks, one can say that Beethoven had high levels of lead in his hair. And the assumption is that that is an indicator that he had high levels of lead in his bloodstream and in his other organs, other non-hair organs. But, the question that follows, because really what we're ultimately talking about is why did Beethoven go deaf, is can chronic lead toxicity / poisoning, whatever we want to call it, can that lead to deafness?
That's, of course, a key question. Chronic lead toxicity, it can cause neuropsychiatric symptoms, including hearing loss in both children and adults. I came across a study from 1993 published in the International Journal of Psychophysiology that examined the auditory nerve conduction from 22 people who had an average of about 10 years of occupational lead exposure. And they found that lead exposure, it was associated with impaired impulse conduction of auditory nerve signals to the brainstem, and higher levels had more impaired conduction. And these were actually people who were asymptomatic. So they had been exposed to lead, didn't have any like clinical hearing loss, but when they checked their, like their auditory nerve function, it was impaired. A population study from 2010 out of the VA that was published in Hearing Research, that they found that lead exposure, it increased the risk of age-related hearing loss. And then a 2021 meta-analysis in the Journal of Public Health supported this association too. So it seems like lead is certainly can be autotoxic, probably by multiple mechanisms, one of which is cochlear toxicity, and then another is neuronal damage. So definitely not good for hearing.
And when I think about some of the other symptoms that Beethoven had, in some ways, I often, when we're talking about him, come back to this in what appears to be an inflamed and painful eye. And, we could have guesses as to whether or not he had uveitis, but I often think about inflamed, painful eyes as being, again, part of some syndrome. And could this be part of the syndrome of chronic lead poisoning? Is that something that you've seen, that lead can lead to eye problems?
I'm honestly not sure. I found some literature on various like ocular impacts of lead poisoning, like cataracts, retinopathy, which happens by inducing apoptosis specifically of the rod cells. It can cause retinal vasculopathy and retinal edema. I came across reports of exposure keratopathy, which probably would be maybe more painful than some of the other conditions that we listed here. And these were in metal workers who got lead like in their eyes, like from dust. But Beethoven would have been ingesting the lead, not doing metallurgy. So honestly, I think the association, I know.
Was it pouring the plumbed wine into his eye?
Just drop by drop. It seems like if there is an association, definitely less strong, and I think harder to tie to Beethoven's symptoms.
That seems fair.
And I remember Beethoven also had these chronic joint pains and chronic GI symptoms. That one seems pretty plausibly lead associated.
Yeah, great point, Hannah. And I think, it absolutely could from, that sort of the syndromes it can cause.
One thing I do wonder, so you were mentioning that basically lead was everywhere. We know it was also high in the Hillerloch. So whoever that person was, she also had probably lead poisoning. And so if Beethoven was getting exposed to so much lead in his daily life, was he really that unique among people of his time? Was it just really common to get lead poisoning?
I think this is also, again, a crucial question. Like if we're going to invoke lead poisoning as a potential primary cause for Beethoven's deafness, was this like, why him? Was this something that affected him specifically? And as you're alluding to, the reality in, human populations, especially those in cultures that became more sort of developed, began to manufacture things, people living in these societies had extensive exposure to lead going back thousands of years, right? The very high lead levels in the water supply of the Roman Empire and in their wine is well established. There have been similar measurements made in like the sediments from medieval water supply, those sort of levels around Rome. And so very high lead levels, again, spanning thousands of years. Bringing things to Beethoven's time in history, 18th and the 19th century Europe, chronic symptomatic lead exposure, extremely common, especially in occupational contexts and like contamination of drinking water. You had lead containing makeup and paint, medical therapies, and lead acetate was also used to treat diarrheal disease. So just this constant exposure. And so because lead was everywhere around the time that Beethoven lived, I think it's not surprising that he had high lead levels in his hair. And like, as you mentioned, Hannah, like the Hillerloch wasn't his hair. And it had really high lead levels too. So I think the question remains, like, did it contribute to his deafness?
And ultimately, we're not going to know for sure, right? This is all hypothesis generation and sort of testing our hypotheses with whatever locks that we have available. But at the same time, like I can't imagine that most people in 18th century Germany were walking around with early onset hearing loss and deafness, despite the fact that potentially many of them had smoldering lead toxicity. I mean, obviously, as we've been talking about, Beethoven, it appears, had chronic some form of lead toxicity. So I don't know. It would seem like a reasonable thing to assume that more than one thing was going on with Beethoven, and even if lead toxicity was one of them, there's probably something else. And he may be one of these good examples where Hickham's dictum kind of has to win out over Occam's razor, where the patient, in this case Beethoven, can have as many diseases as he damn well pleases. Is that how you've kind of put him together ultimately, Avi?
Tony, that was my first thought when I read about the updated lead level data, which is super fascinating. It's compelling. I do wonder if it's potentially not enough to completely explain his hearing loss. And that's because I don't think it necessarily accounts for the other piece of evidence, like physical evidence that we have for him, and that's his autopsy. And as we discussed in episode 72, before he died in 1827, he specifically requested an autopsy so that perhaps the mystery of his hearing loss could be solved, in a historical way, even if he himself wouldn't know the answer. And so, of course, here we are, we're discussing this question almost 200 years later. And when his autopsy was completed by Johann Wagner and Karl Rokitansky, they found abnormalities both within the auditory nerves and the arteries. And with the nerves, Beethoven's nerves were thin and atrophied, and the auditory arteries were hard and sclerotic. Wagner noted in his notes that Beethoven's auditory arteries, and this is a quote that we mentioned in episode 72, thickened and cartilaginous as though stretched over a raven's quill. And so I don't know much at all about lead-induced hearing loss, but my sense is that it tends to be more sensorineural. And Beethoven, he seems to have had some sort of focal vasculopathy affecting the vasculature of his inner ear. This is venturing more into forensics, really, with the sort of questions about the reliability of a 200-year-old autopsy. But I'm not sure that what Wagner and Rokitansky found lines up well with an exclusive diagnosis of chronic lead poisoning, leading to his deafness, if we want to believe what they saw.
So, to recap a little bit, all of what we know and all of what we don't, we know that Beethoven went to conclude this morning report. We know that Beethoven went deaf pretty early in life. We know that he had these multi-system protean symptoms like chronic joint and abdominal pain, diarrhea. He had an inflamed eye for a period over a year. And that our workup so far has been notable for very high lead levels in his body at the end of his life, genetic risk factors for hemochromatosis as a compound heterozygote, and a focal vasculopathy in his inner ear. We know an impressive amount about someone who died in 1827.
Yeah, that was a great summary. And one thing that you said, I think, is really important. It's that we know that he had elevated lead levels in his body in the 1820s when the Berman and Hom-Thayer locks were first obtained from the composer himself. Beethoven started going deaf decades before. And so we don't really have any evidence to confirm whether or not he had elevated lead levels earlier in life, decades before, when he started losing his hearing. I think that's an unanswerable question right now.
And it really seems to be that with the vasculopathy in the inner ear on autopsy, and the fact that we can't necessarily correlate time-wise the locks with the time when his hearing loss began, it's beginning to look a little bit more like we've got a Hickham's dictum situation here, Avi.
Yeah, if you were to ask me, which of course no one is, my opinion doesn't really matter whatsoever. My money would be on a theory of sort of multiple additive causes for his deafness, with chronic lead toxicity probably being one major contributor, but maybe not even the primary one. And that's because I don't think lead poisoning can adequately account for his autopsy findings, specifically those hardened auditory arteries. if any of our listeners know of cases where lead could do that, we would love to hear from you. But and we can certainly give another update on a future episode. But I didn't find any cases of reported of that association. I did some AI enhanced searching on open evidence as well. Nothing was coming up from what I could find. So I think it seems very plausible that lead poisoning could have exacerbated his hearing loss, both in severity and the early onset. But I still think it's possible, if not likely, that he had a different primary cause. Again, we discussed other possibilities in episode 72, syphilis, Cogan syndrome, many others. So I think maybe not completely solved.
But an interesting facet, an interesting breaking news update in a 200-year-old case regardless. Is there anything else you wanted to share or update us on?
Well, as we covered in Bringing Up Beethoven, we discussed a study from April 2023 published in Cell, where the researchers found that he was a compound heterozygote for 2 HFE gene mutations, which can, of course, cause hemochromatosis. As we touched on previously, those study authors emphasized that because of the low penetrance of HFE gene mutations, we can't know if he was clinically iron overloaded and had hemochromatosis or not, just that he had risk factors for it. And I couldn't find much about any association specifically with hemochromatosis and chronic hearing loss. There was an interesting case control study out of Italy published in 2015 that suggested perhaps dysregulated iron homeostasis in the inner ear, caused by a specific ferroportin gene polymorphism might predispose to hearing loss. But that's sort of the one maybe association that I found, but wasn't much.
That did interest me. So I had looked this up a little bit because you sort of think, these are 2 metals. Maybe, we talk often about divalent cations or, just metals in general and metal absorption. I did find a couple of papers about polymorphisms or common mutations or changes in the HFE gene, which is what Beethoven was a compound heterozygote for, that showed that people who are battery workers, so people who are getting chronic lead exposure, are at higher risk of accumulating lead and lead toxicity if they have an HFE, one of these common mutations or polymorphisms in the HFE gene. That's we can link to that in the show notes. It still doesn't seem to explain the feathered quill appearance of the auditory artery, but also, I wonder if it might have affected his risk for arsenic toxicity and all those other metals that you were mentioning that he was exposed to.
Yeah, I think that's super fascinating, and it does sort of drive home the amazing that he just was exposed to so much, both externally and perhaps even internally, if he had hemochromatosis. And so I think it certainly sounds like he could have been at higher risk for lead toxicity, if so. So that was a great find.
This episode has been an ode to Hickham's dictum.
Avi, do you have
I think that's warranted sometimes.
Yeah, actually, it's probably warranted more often than it isn't warranted.
Yeah, I think more often than we're comfortable saying.
Avi, some updated take-home points before we plan for the 3rd version of Beethoven episodes?
Well, honestly, it's just that Beethoven's story continues to evolve, continues to fascinate. I love that we keep getting more evidence about his health. And again, like we talked about, it's remarkable that we have so much even new information coming out about someone that died so long ago. But at the same time, it feels like the more we learn, the less we know, which is a cool place to be.
Fantastic. And that wraps up another episode of the Curious Clinicians. Thank you, as always, for joining us. Claire Morgan of Notterly.com is our podcast audio editor, and Giancarlo Bonomo is a producer for the show. You can join our mailing list at CuriousClinicians.com to stay up to date on episode releases and have detailed notes delivered directly to your inbox. You can subscribe to our Substack at thecuriousclinicians.substack.com or to our YouTube channel. Physicians and other healthcare professionals can earn CME and MOC credits from VCU Health just for listening to this episode. For more information, visit ce.vcuhealth.org/Curious Clinicians. And as always, the information contained in this episode is for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute medical advice. Until next time, we've been the Curious Clinicians.